Everyone knows the story of original sin, the flood, an angry God, and humanity in constant decline. But what almost no one knows is that the greatest rebellion didn't begin on earth. It began in heaven, and when it fell, it brought more than destruction. It brought knowledge. A kind of knowledge that turned ordinary men into corrupted gods. Something the Bible hints at in a few verses, but the Book of Enoch shouts through the silence. A secret so powerful, it was ripped from sacred scripture and buried for centuries. You're about to hear what the ancients called the forbidden story of civilization's true origin. But be warned, after this, you will never look at the sky the same way again. Before the commandments, before the cross, before Moses even set foot on the mountain, there was another meeting between heaven and earth. But this time, it wasn't God who descended. It was beings who claimed to be sons of heaven, but carried a strange fire within them. They came down upon the sacred mountains in days when men didn't yet know the name of fear. The Bible, in Genesis 6, calls them the sons of God. But the Book of Enoch reveals what really happened. They were the watchers, angels sent to guard and protect, who fell in love with what they were only meant to observe. And that was the beginning of collapse. Imagine a world where angels walk among men, not as messengers, but as masters. A world where heaven didn't just watch, it interfered and taught. These watchers taught magic, astrology, metallurgy, enchantments, abortions, weapons, sorcery. They gave humanity the secrets of the heights, like handing fire to a child. The Book of Enoch lists the names of the leaders of this rebellion, one by one. Semjaza, Azazel, Arachiel, Barachiel, names that thunder through silence like ancient echoes. They did not come to destroy, they came to teach. And that was the greatest danger of all. But why was that so serious? Why would teaching be cause for eternal condemnation? The answer lies in something modern man has forgotten. Knowledge without maturity destroys. What the Watchers taught wasn't forbidden because it was evil, but because it was too sacred. Wisdom that required purity, patience, sacrifice. And mankind used it as a weapon. The women were corrupted. The civilizations were born stained. And the children of these unions would become the beings that changed everything. They were called the Nephilim, the giants, not just in stature, but in influence. They ruled, they corrupted, they built cities, founded royal bloodlines, and were worshipped as gods. The Greeks would later call them Titans, the Sumerians, the Anunnaki, but Enoch calls them what they truly were, spiritual aberrations, children of a union that was never meant to exist. And wherever the Nephilim walked, the earth groaned. Their footsteps were mistaken for miracles, but they were ruins announcing judgment. While all this unfolded, heaven was not silent. Enoch himself was chosen, taken from among men, to become the scribe of heaven. He was brought by the angels to record it all. The names of the rebels, the corrupted teachings, the fate of the Nephilim, and the judgment to come. Enoch was not a warrior, nor a common prophet. He was the witness chosen to tell the truth that would be buried until now, and everything he wrote was hidden, torn from sacred texts, and condemned as heresy. But why would such an important record be hidden? Who would benefit from erasing the story of the Watchers? The answer is deeper than it seems. Because this story isn't just about the past. It reveals the origin of the spiritual war we still live in. It shows why the world is collapsing. It exposes the original plan that was interrupted. And more than that, it reveals that the same ones who came down long ago may never have left. Conflicting emotions arise when reading Enoch for the first time. A blend of wonder and dread, as if something ancient is being reawakened inside of you. And that's where the true danger of this book lies. It doesn't just inform, it awakens. It awakens questions that religions won't answer. It awakens memories that history can't confirm. It awakens the feeling that maybe we always knew, but we forgot. And maybe that's why it was banned, because it gives back what was taken from us. This is not just a forgotten book. It is an indictment, a spiritual record of a war that began before time and still unfolds in the background of the human soul. Every line in the Book of Enoch is a scar, the echo of something that fell from heaven and dragged part of us with it. Maybe you've never heard this story before, but now that you have, it will start to follow you. Because every time you look at ancient monuments, at the myths of nations, at the legends of gods, you will remember the Watchers. You will remember the sons of heaven, who taught too much. And you'll wonder if the world we live in is really as natural as it seems. Maybe everything we were told in pulpits, in universities, in official history, ignored the most dangerous story ever written. If this story has already begun to change the way you see the world, subscribe to the channel. There are still truths no one dares to reveal. When the Watchers descended, they didn't bring weapons. They brought knowledge, but not the kind that saves, the kind that controls. And that's what changed everything. Because the greatest deception in Eden wasn't the serpent, it was the desire to know without being ready. And these fallen angels, by teaching men, repeated the serpent's pattern. They offered a shortcut, a path without the cross, power without surrender. They revealed the secrets of heaven to a race that still crawled upon the earth. And the result was a spiritual collapse that shaped civilization from the very beginning. Enoch calls these teachings eternal sins, not only because of what they were, but because of what they caused. Semjaza, leader of the Watchers, taught enchantments and the secrets of roots. Azazel taught men how to forge swords, daggers, shields, and mirrors. And with that, vanity and war. Armaros taught spellbinding. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabel revealed the signs of the stars. Ezekiel, the movements of the moon. And all of this was given as a gift, but it was a cursed gift, because what should have been revealed slowly, through spiritual elevation, was dumped upon humanity like an avalanche. The result? A civilization that believed it was wise, but was on the brink of destruction. These secrets gave birth to the first form of idolatry. Men began to look to the heavens, but not to God. They looked to those who descended. They built altars, carved their faces into stone, celebrated their feats with blood and sacrifice. The Nephilim, children of the Watchers, became kings, heroes, tyrants. They founded cities, raised monuments that still stand today, and inspired legends that echo across millennia. But what no one dared to say is that all that greatness had a price, a trail of spiritual devastation, moral corruption, and soul decay. When you hear about pyramids, ziggurats, obelisks, ancient gateways, maybe you're seeing more than architecture. You're seeing marks of intervention, marks of the fallen, marks from a time when humanity skipped steps, when it stopped seeking God and started chasing the power of gods. And the more men learned from these beings, the more they drifted from what made them human. Because in trying to become like the heavens, they forgot they came from dust, and that forgetfulness sealed their fate. But the most disturbing part is that many of the Watchers' teachings still exist today, disguised, repackaged as science, magic, philosophy, esoteric practices, and even religion. Astrology, for example, did not come from the East. It was taught by Kokabel, a fallen angel. The use of metal for war and seduction, Azazel, and the modern obsession with images, filters, beauty, rituals, all of it has roots far older than we imagine. Roots that did not come from Earth, but from a celestial rebellion. Enoch exposes all of this in detail, but the most shocking part is this. He doesn't write like a man who condemns. He writes like one who mourns, like someone who saw the beauty of heaven trampled by angels who fell in love with flesh. Someone who understood that the problem wasn't only what they taught, but how we responded. Because the Watchers offered, but we accepted, we desired, we built the altars to these fallen masters, and we called them gods. That's why the judgment that came afterward wasn't just for the angels, it was for humanity too. Because in receiving the secrets, we became accomplices. We took part in the fall, and even today we carry fragments of those teachings in our culture, our language, our art, and our spirituality. Fragments that shape the way we see the world without realizing it. Fragments that influence our deepest desires. As if the Watchers are still whispering in the ears of history. That's why this book was silenced. Because it doesn't just accuse celestial beings, it accuses us. It accuses our hunger to know, our rush to dominate, our obsession with spiritual control. Enoch knew his words wouldn't be welcomed, but he wrote them anyway. Because he knew the day would come when someone would ask, where did all of this come from? And when that question was asked from a broken heart, the words he wrote would finally be heard. Now you understand. The Watchers didn't come just to teach. They came to prove. to prove that even angels can fall. And when they fall, they drag multitudes with them. They proved that knowledge can be a blessing or a curse, and that the greatest tragedy in sacred history wasn't what we learned, it was what we forgot. We forgot that all things sacred require time, purity, reverence, and when these are ignored, even heaven can collapse into ruins. And now that you know this, maybe you'll begin to notice the signs, in the cities, in the technologies, in rituals disguised as science, in modern practices that echo ancient ones, because they are still among us, not in form, but in influence, not as angels, but as ideas, as seeds. And those seeds are growing in silence. And everything points to one truth. Heaven will descend to earth once more, but this time, not to teach, to judge. Do you also feel that some knowledge was never meant to be revealed? Leave a comment and share your insight. Let's remember together what humanity has forgotten. When heaven goes silent, it's not out of indifference, it's preparation. While the watchers were teaching in secret, the Most High was watching. The throne was not empty, and in the appointed time, the response came, not with thunder, but with written judgment. According to the Book of Enoch, the faithful angels gathered to deliberate. Michael, Raphael, Uriel, Gabriel, they rose with solemn faces. They did not come as messengers, they came as judges. Heaven had tolerated the insolence of the fallen for too long. Now, every name would be read, every act recorded, and judgment would be sealed. The first decree wasn't destruction. It was revelation. The Most High commanded that Enoch, the chosen man, be lifted into the heavens to witness and record everything, not as punishment, but as memory. Because what is not remembered is repeated. Enoch became a heavenly scribe, but before writing, he was taken to see, to feel, to grasp the weight of the fall. What he saw were not just corrupted cities. He saw the tears of the righteous, the innocent blood spilled by the children of the Nephilim, the cries of the oppressed, and the silence of the earth, a silence begging for justice. The watchers, upon realizing they had been exposed, did the unthinkable. They pleaded with Enoch to intercede for them. They begged for mercy, but not from the Creator, from the scribe. They knew they could no longer ascend. They were cut off, but maybe, just maybe, a pure human could speak on their behalf. So Enoch withdrew. He fasted. He remained silent, and he brought the plea of the fallen angels before the throne. And there, between heaven and the abyss, something happened that no religion dares to mention. Mercy was denied, because there had been time for repentance, but they did not regret the act, only its consequence. The Most High replied with words firm and final. You shall never again ascend to heaven. You shall never again behold the faces of the holy. You shall never again find peace. It was the decree of eternal severance. The watchers would be cast into the abyss of darkness, imprisoned until the great day of the final judgment. Their sons, the Nephilim, would be erased from the face of the earth, and their spirits would wander among men as shadows, seducing, corrupting, and confusing. These spirits, according to Enoch, are what we now call demons. They did not come from hell. They came from the wombs of abominations. The judgment was sealed with names. Each fallen angel had his sentence recorded. Azazel was separated, bound, buried in Dudael, a desert of sharp stones, blinded, covered in eternal darkness, so that he would see every day the consequences of his pride. The others were locked in spiritual caverns, places of waiting, where screams do not echo and time does not move. And over them it was declared, neither your sons nor your sons' sons shall ever dwell among the righteous. An eternal severance, not from existence, but from communion. Yet the earth still suffered, the Nephilim still walked, and the Most High decided to cleanse the world with an extreme act, the flood, not as punishment, but as reset. Because when the foundations are corrupted, destruction is not vengeance, it's reconstruction. And so Enoch was taken, removed from the earth before the waters came. He would not see the destruction, only write of it, because his eyes had seen too much, and his writings would be hidden until the world was ready to listen. But what's most striking is that even with judgment sealed, the teachings of the Watchers were not erased. Many survived, preserved by secret bloodlines, by corrupted priests, by kings who still adored the gods of old. And so the post-flood world, though cleansed on the surface, still bore the spiritual wreckage of the fall. And that's why evil persists. Not because the Watchers remain free, but because their words still echo. The judgment of the Watchers then was not just an event, it was a sign. A reminder that even the highest can fall, and that every spiritual rebellion leaves deep scars. The Book of Enoch is not myth, it is a mirror, a warning, a whisper from heaven saying, "Be careful what you long to learn. Be careful who you call teacher. Be careful with shortcuts that look like light, but hide an abyss." And now, with the names of the fallen recorded, the decree sealed, and the gates closed, only one question remains. Have we truly learned from this judgment? Or are we, once again, walking toward the same mistake? Because heaven may judge angels, but men are still free to choose who they listen to. And maybe, just maybe, the Watchers were not the last to teach secrets we were never meant to know. What would you do if you heard the cries of condemned angels? If this stirred something within you, leave a comment. Your voice may awaken someone else. The flood came. The earth was washed clean. The Nephilim were destroyed. But then, a troubling line appears in the biblical text. In those days there were giants on the earth, and also afterward. Genesis 6:4. Afterward? If the judgment was total, why did their presence persist? The answer isn't in Genesis. It's in Enoch. The bodies were destroyed, but the spirits of the Nephilim remained, homeless, restless, condemned to wander the earth as aimless entities. Unclean spirits, sowers of confusion, seducers of minds, living fragments of rebellion. According to Enoch, these spirits are what we now call demons. They are not fallen angels. They are the children of angels and human women, hybrid creatures with no place in heaven or earth. When their bodies died, their souls could not return to the source. They were bound to the earthly realm, feeding on fear, vanity, violence, and desire. They are the spiritual echoes of the first great corruption, invisible to the eye, but visible in their effects, behind senseless wars, behind collective obsessions, behind modern idolatries. They have no thrones, yet they rule empires. That's why in so many cultures across the world, giants never completely vanished. There are records of beings with supernatural stature in the myths of the Sumerians, Egyptians, Greeks, Mayans, Aztecs, Norse, Chinese, and African peoples. All speak of titans, fallen gods, towering heroes. But what if they're all distorted memories of the same lineage? A lineage that returned, that preserved itself, that no longer needs a body, only worship. Because what the Nephilim lost in flesh, they gained in spiritual influence. The most terrifying part is realizing that the worship of ancient gods never truly stopped. Only their names changed. The rituals continue. The offerings look different. But the principle is the same. A connection with entities that no longer belong to this world. And it all began with the children of the Watchers. They died, but their essence contaminated the spiritual structure of humanity. And that's why so many civilizations collapse in the same cycle. They rise in power, grow in arrogance, and fall in destruction. Because the giants never disappear. They just change thrones. Enoch writes that these spirits will remain active until the day of final judgment. They cannot be destroyed by weapons, nor defeated by sermons, because they do not dwell in matter. They live in thought, in culture, in human desire. That's why spiritual wars aren't won with force, but with clarity, with fasting, with silence, with discernment. Where there is pride, they settle. Where there is thirst for power, they multiply. And where there is forgetfulness, they reign. Enoch also suggests that even after the flood, some teachings of the Watchers were preserved, passed down by hidden bloodlines, by those who kept pacts, who fed the spirits of the Nephilim with sacrifices, words, rituals. That's why certain families, certain orders, certain empires always seem to prosper at the world's expense, because they didn't follow God's law, they followed the whispers of the fallen. This is the war that never ended, a war of influence, of memory, of faith. The giants that did not die continue operating through human structures, sometimes in governments, other times in religions, in trends, in ideologies. They don't need to appear. They only need you to forget where they came from, because spiritual ignorance is their greatest weapon. When you don't know where the darkness came from, you end up worshiping its false lights. And when you worship what poisons you, chains aren't necessary. You imprison yourself. And maybe now you understand why the Book of Enoch was rejected by so many councils. Because it doesn't just denounce doctrine, it denounces influence. It points to the shadows hiding in palaces, pulpits, and platforms, and boldly declares, they are still here, not with swords, but with algorithms, not with stone giants, but with giants of the mind, ideas, narratives, sacred lies. There's a moment when Enoch, overwhelmed, asks why the world remains so corrupted even after judgment. And the answer he receives is both simple and devastating. Because the memory of the fall was buried, and as long as it remains hidden, the fall will continue. Forgetfulness is the fuel of the watchers, and that is why this script exists, to remember, to reignite, to reveal. Because the time is drawing near, and the giants no longer hide, they only wait. And now that you know they never died, maybe you'll start seeing them where once you saw only coincidence, in symbols, in speeches, in smiles. Because not every greatness is a sign of blessing. Sometimes it's just the echo of an ancient rebellion, one that began with angels, and will only end when men finally awaken. If all of this still lives in new forms, what else are we ignoring? Share in the comments. Where do you see the echoes of the giants today? If the bodies died, and the names were buried, why do we still feel like something is watching us? Why are ancient symbols carved into modern buildings? Why do ideas born in the days of Enoch still shape today's systems? The answer lies in silence. A silence that is not absence, but infiltration. The watchers no longer needed to be present. It was enough for their ideas to survive. Enough for their principles to be adopted. Enough for the world to forget their origin and call their influence progress. The corrupted knowledge was planted like seeds, and today, we reap its fruits in the most ordinary forms. In how we treat time, in how we treat our bodies, in how we use technology to simulate divinity. The vanity taught by Azazel lives in our screens. The astrology taught by Kokabel became entertainment. The seduction taught by Penemu became marketing strategy. None of this is coincidence. It's continuity. And as long as we call it evolution, we'll never notice we are repeating the fall, only now with aesthetics and Wi-Fi. There is a silent spiritual structure that governs the modern world. It doesn't need visible thrones or flaming angels. It only needs a world disconnected from truth, a world that rejects silence, introspection, and spiritual wisdom, and embraces urgency, performance, and control. This is what the Watchers wanted from the beginning, to replace communion with ritual, essence with appearance, ascent with shortcuts, and once that becomes normal, there's no need to corrupt. Men will walk the path alone. Enoch describes this influence as a constant whisper that inhabits the mountains and the cities. He saw the spirit of rebellion not in demons with horns, but in everyday decisions, in the exchange of good for beautiful, of truth for functionality, of the eternal for the immediate. And if you pay attention, you'll notice this inversion is everywhere. In systems that praise success over purity, in speeches that glorify autonomy over truth, in hearts that seek power and call it blessing. That's why the Watchers didn't need to return. The world was adjusted to go on without them, but with everything they taught. And maybe that was the greatest victory of the rebellion, to turn chaos into culture, and culture into dogma. Today, those who speak of fasting, holiness, or silence are seen as strange. But those who echo the words of the fallen, they get applause, contracts, influence. Because the Watchers, when they fell, planted an inversion that still touches even the holiest words. What's most painful is realizing even religious structures have been contaminated. Enoch foresaw this when he wrote, "Many temples will be built in honor of the fallen, even if unknowingly." And today, what do we see? Doctrines that promote the worship of emotion. Churches where God's name is invoked, but the fruits are vanity, greed, and domination. How do we tell the sacred from the theatrical? How do we discern true light from false fire? The criterion is simple. but radical. That which draws us away from repentance comes from them. We're not dealing with old stories. We're dealing with codes that are still active. They infiltrated education, science, art, politics, and even faith. And this is not a conspiracy theory. It is spiritual reading. It's what Enoch tried to teach, that the real war isn't against flesh and blood, but against thoughts, against spiritual principles that appear as wisdom, but destroy in silence. They don't shout, they whisper, with logic. And that is what makes them so dangerous. Have you ever wondered why so many spiritual truths were erased? Why books like Enoch were banned? Why deep fasting was discredited? Because these are weapons against the invisible rebellion. They are reminders of a purity we lost. And every system that wants to preserve the chaos must eliminate all traces of the original light. Enoch was silenced because his very existence is disturbing, because he reveals what we'd rather not know. That may be, we're on the wrong side without even realizing it. And now that you've seen this, there's a choice. There's no return to ignorance. The question that now echoes is, whose voice guides your life? The silent creator, or the eloquent fallen ones? They are no longer in the mountains. They're in the algorithms, in the speeches, in the narratives that tell us what is right without asking what is true. And if we go on without discernment, the rebellion will feel like revolution, and damnation will look like freedom, because their plan was never to appear. It was to influence, never to dominate with power, but to seduce with words. And now that you've recognized them, they will do everything they can to make you forget again. But maybe, just maybe, it's already too late for that. Have you ever felt that something in the world was out of place but couldn't explain it? Share your experience. Others need to know they're not alone. What would you do if you received a knowledge that could either set humanity free or condemn it forever? Would you run, burn it, or write it down? Enoch chose to write, not for the people of his time, but for those of the end times. His words were not written in ordinary ink. They were sealed with testimony, with fasting, with tears, because Enoch saw what no one else saw, the backstage of the fall, the courtroom of heaven, the screams of angels, and the agony of the forgotten righteous. Yet still, he did not give in. He chose to remember. The Book of Enoch is not just an ancient account, it is a spiritual code, a warning, a map. Inside it are detailed descriptions of the heavens, the angelic hierarchies, the names of the fallen, the cosmic laws, the cycles of time, the celestial gates, and the reasons behind the judgment. And most of all, there is one repeated message. These words are for the last days. That's why the book was hidden. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too right, and because it served no religious empire. For centuries, the book lay buried, literally, preserved in Ethiopian scrolls, hidden in caves, protected by tribes who barely understood the language it was written in, but still knew it was sacred. While theologians called it heresy, while councils rejected it, there were people who guarded it like one guards fire in the middle of the desert, because they knew it wasn't meant for everyone. It was meant for those with eyes to see and the courage not to forget. Modern scholars tried to reduce Enoch to a primitive apocalyptic myth. They said it was too symbolic, too mythical, but none of them could explain why so many of its prophecies came true, why it describes the flood before Genesis, why it mentions the same angels that appear in Daniel and Revelation, why it speaks of imprisoned stars, sealed portals, weeping mountains, and books that will be opened at the end of time. This is not coincidence. It is spiritual coherence. Perhaps the most disturbing part of the book is when Enoch warns that in the final days, even the elect will be deceived, that the teachings of the fallen will return, but in new language, that idolatry will disguise itself as science, that the ancient pacts will come back, but in legal contracts, that giants will walk again, but in the mind, and the world once more will celebrate what it should fear and mock what it should revere. And this is exactly what we're seeing. The rebellion, returning, in new clothes and polished smiles. Enoch wasn't afraid to name the fallen, to record their crimes, to write sentences that even angels feared to speak. He wasn't just a visionary, he was a bridge, a threshold between the visible and invisible world. When you read his words, something shifts in your breath. as if holding an ancient secret you somehow already knew, but had forgotten. This book does not teach, it awakens, and that is why it is so dangerous. There's a moment when Enoch pleads with the Creator, asking why he was chosen, and the answer is simple, yet profound. Because you still listen when I speak. That reveals everything. Enoch was chosen not because he was strong, but because he was available. While the world followed its own desires, Enoch still fasted, still listened, still obeyed. And that is what makes him so relevant now. Because in a world where everyone speaks, few still listen. And in a world full of books, few still allow themselves to be written by God. That is why the Book of Enoch is more than an ancient manuscript. It is a spiritual mirror, a reminder that the sacred is not imposed, it is revealed, but only to those who still hunger, only to those who have not yet settled for easy answers, only to those who feel, deep within, that something far greater is waiting to be remembered. And that calling is silent, but not harmless. Because once you hear it, you can no longer pretend you didn't, and maybe that's why you're here, because the time has come, because the books are being opened, because the names are being read, and because the generation that wandered furthest from the origin is the one that most desperately needs to remember. The Book of Enoch was the last to be written before the flood, and maybe it is the final warning before the next. What you do with it might seal more than your understanding. It may seal the fate of your soul. If this book was hidden for centuries, maybe you're among the few who were meant to find it. Like and share this video with those who need to awaken. For centuries, the writings of Enoch were dismissed as allegory, as if they were nothing more than poetic images from a distant past. But those who read with discernment see something else entirely. Warnings, signs, marks in time. Enoch wrote for the final days, not just as a prophet, but as a survivor of a world that existed before the flood. He saw the cycle begin, and he saw how it would end. And now, in an era where everything is visible, traceable, and shareable, his prophecies become so clear that silence has become complicity. One of Enoch's most disturbing visions was the Book of Numbers, a book that recorded the names of the righteous and the corrupted. Every action was written, every thought was registered. Sound familiar? Today, every step we take, every click, every word, every intention is monitored, stored, cross-referenced by algorithms. Enoch saw it. He saw a time when humanity would build its own digital Tower of Babel, a temple of data where every soul would be measured, not by purity, but by engagement. Another astonishing prophecy is the vision of the shattered heavens. He described a time when the stars would be thrown into confusion and the paths of heaven would be violated. Scholars assumed he meant corrupted astrology, but what if it's more literal? Satellites, space exploration, atmospheric manipulation, tears in the physical and spiritual heavens. The routes once reserved for divine messengers are now crossed by rockets and drones. The sky has been profaned, and Enoch saw it, centuries before it could even be imagined. Enoch also spoke of a generation with hearts hardened by knowledge, people who would know everything, but understand nothing, who would have access to all information, but lack wisdom. Today, we're drowning in knowledge, but starving for direction. We know how the universe works, but have forgotten why it was created. We alter genes, but can't heal the soul. Enoch described this collapse of the spirit, an era where technical knowledge would silence the voice of the divine. And maybe the clearest sign of all is the prophecy of kings without thrones. He wrote, "In the end, rulers will be puppets, and real power will belong to unseen voices." Today, we call them systems, corporations, networks, influences. But Enoch saw it first. He foresaw a time when visible authority would have no soul, and the real masters would be those no one named. Invisible watchers, no longer as angels, but as ideas, as structures, as entities disguised as efficiency. He also spoke of religion without spirit, of faith without reverence, of temples built in God's name, but whose hearts bowed to the fallen. He saw crowds chasing miracles, but not transformation. He saw spiritual leaders worshiping themselves, and the name of the Most High used as a product, as a performance, and not as a presence. This is right before our eyes, on television, on social media, on stages where glory was replaced by spectacle. The words of Enoch were not written to frighten. They were written to awaken. But awakening takes courage, because once your eyes open, you can't walk the same path. And when you realize the signs are everywhere, the entire world changes color. You begin to see the gears, the masks, the codes. You begin to understand that many so-called novelties are just ancient spiritual strategies, refined. The plan never changed. It only evolved. And if all of this is true, then time is being fulfilled. Because Enoch wrote that when the signs became visible to the pure in heart, the time of return would begin, the return of justice, of memory, of reckoning, and of judgment. That's why many reject this book, because it doesn't just inform, it convicts, it presses, it drives the soul to a threshold. You either surrender or you hide. But there is nowhere left to hide. The words have been spoken. The prophecies are unfolding. The cycles are closing. And those who read with spiritual eyes feel it. Something is coming. It's not fear, it's urgency. As if heaven is calling out to those who still hear, to those who still haven't made peace with the darkness, to those who still cry when reading forgotten truths. Because for them, the Book of Enoch is not an ending, it's a beginning. And now that all of this has been revealed, you must choose what to do with this knowledge. Will you ignore it? Dismiss it? Or will you let this truth transform you? Because the time for excuses is over. Enoch didn't write to impress. He wrote to seal. And if you've read this far, maybe you are one of the few who were called to remember. Enoch wrote for today, and you're here. If you feel these words were meant for you, write "I remember" in the comments. Most people imagine the end of days as an explosion, a physical collapse. Sudden, inescapable. But Enoch saw something far more subtle and far more dangerous. He saw a judgment that begins from within, a separation that occurs in the spirit long before it touches the body, a cut no one sees, but one that changes everything. The final judgment doesn't begin with trumpets. It begins with remembrance. It begins when the eyes begin to see again what was forgotten, when the sleeping soul is called back to the place it was never supposed to leave. The Book of Enoch describes this judgment in detail, but not as punishment, as consequence. The watchers will be cast into the eternal abyss. The Nephilim will have no resurrection, their spirits will dissolve, and the humans who chose their path will have nowhere to hide. Enoch says a book will be opened, a court will be convened where souls will be weighed, not by how much they failed, but by the truth they ignored. The problem was never making mistakes. It was pretending not to know. It was mocking the light. It was choosing the echo of the fallen over the whisper of the Creator. And then the return will come, but not of temples, not of doctrines. The return of the ancient days will be the return of essence, a restoration of what existed before the fall, before the watchers, before the desire to know without being ready. It will be the time of the pure in heart, those who fast in secret, who listen in silence, who remember eternity, even when everyone around them lives only for the instant. They will be lifted, not by merit, but by memory, because they recognize the sound of what was lost. Enoch writes of a time when the heavens will open once again, but this time, not to teach, not to warn, but to harvest. He speaks of hidden elect, scattered across the earth, who would be awakened like torches in the darkness. They will have no pulpits, but they will carry presence, no thrones, but they will carry authority, because they were forged in the fire of waiting. And this generation might be ours, because never have so many spoken of the end, while longing so deeply for a beginning. And in that time, the teachings of the watchers will lose their grip, because they will be exposed, because they will be defeated, not by conflict, but by contrast. Where there is purity, seduction cannot enter. Where there is light, lies cannot remain. Where truth is lived, deception collapses. That's why the final answer won't come from any institution. It will come from within, from the womb, from the tear, from the spirit that refuses to forget, that refuses to repeat the fall, that refuses to worship any light that doesn't come from the source. Enoch didn't write a script of destruction. He wrote a map of return. He showed where we fell, but also where we rise. And that point of restoration begins now, not when the world changes, but when you change. When your hunger is no longer for answers, but for reverence. When your heart stops seeking shortcuts and starts walking with the Creator in the cool of the morning, as it was in the beginning, as it still can be. And that's why this script doesn't end in apocalypse. It ends with an invitation, because the end isn't the end. If you still remember who you are not the product of a rebellion. You are the echo of an origin. You are not the result of the fallen. You are the image of the eternal. And even if the whole world has forgotten that, if even one remembers, that's enough for the return to begin. Because restoration begins in the unseen. And maybe that's why you've made it this far. Because something in you still feels, still remembers, still weeps for what was lost, still listens when no one else listens. And if that's true, then you are not alone. There are others, scattered, awakening, gathering the fragments of forgotten truth. Because what the Watchers corrupted, the Spirit is rebuilding, one by one, silently, but with glory. The Book of Enoch ends with a blessing, not for the perfect, but for those who remain, for those who remember, for those who did not bow to the noise of the world. And this blessing is not fame nor power. It is something far more rare. It is living memory of what we once were, and what we will be again. And if you carry this with you, even when all others forget, even when they mock you, then the final judgment will not be your end. It will be your beginning.